the smell of kerosene mixed with the metallic odor of fear. He held the lighter with trembling hands, staring at the wooden houses before him as children's screams pierced his eardrums. His commander had been clear: burn everything, leave no one alive. But his fingers froze. Why, he didn't know. He would never know. Until 20 years later, a yellowed envelope revealed the impossible. In that Ukrainian village he was supposed to incinerate was his own mother, his younger brother, the woman who nursed him and the man who carried his same blood. And he, unknowingly, saved them. This is the story of how a moment of hesitation defied the Third Reich and rewrote the fate of an entire family. But before we continue, check if you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. Your presence here carries a purpose. This content reached you at the right time. It was October 1941. Operation Barbarossa was devouring the Soviet Union like a hungry beast, and Karl Schneider was just another cog in that destruction machine. 23 years old, close-cropped blonde hair, blue eyes that had already seen too much for someone so young. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't born wanting to kill. But war transforms men into shadows of themselves, and Karl was disappearing a little more with each order fulfilled. That cold morning, his platoon received direct instructions from high command: clean a village 60 kilometers from Kiev. Clean. That was the word they used. As if they were dusting furniture, not erasing human lives from the face of the earth. The village was called Kolodiazne. 340 inhabitants, Jews, gypsies suspected of harboring partisans. It didn't matter. The order was absolute. Karl led the fire squad, literally. His function was to burn the houses after the residents were gathered. He carried cans of kerosene, fuses, lighters, tools of annihilation. As the truck advanced along the potholed road, he looked at his own hands and didn't recognize them. When did they start trembling like this? When did the reflection in the window glass become the face of a stranger? They arrived at the village at noon. The silence was unnatural. People already knew. They always knew. Children cried softly inside the houses. Old people prayed in languages Karl didn't understand. His commander, Hauptmann Müller, was a man as dry as a dead tree branch, without emotion, without doubt. He pointed to the cluster of houses to the north and said, "Schneider, start there, 10 minutes. I want to see smoke." Karl nodded, grabbed the cans, started walking. Each step sounded like a funeral drum in his ears. He reached the first house, a simple construction, rotting wooden walls, thatched roof. Through the window he saw a boy. Couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Dark hair, enormous eyes fixed on Karl. There was no fear in that gaze. There was something worse: acceptance. As if that child had already understood that the world was unjust and cruel, and there was nothing to be done. Karl poured the kerosene on the wall. The liquid dripped, shiny and viscous. He took the lighter from his pocket, opened it, closed it, opened it again. His thumb hovered over the ignition wheel. A simple movement, 1 second, and that house would turn to ashes, and that boy would die suffocated or burned alive. But something inside him broke. It wasn't pity, it wasn't heroism. It was something more primitive. A silent scream from the soul that said, "Don't do this, not this time, not here." He put away the lighter. Karl looked around. Müller was on the other side of the village, shouting orders. The other soldiers were busy gathering the residents in the central square. No one was watching him. No one saw. He had maybe 2-3 minutes before someone noticed there was no smoke coming from that house. He knocked on the door, hard, 3 times. "Get out," he said in German, then repeated in badly pronounced Russian, "Get out, now. Forrest, run!" The door opened slowly. It was a woman. Must have been about 40 years old, but looked 70. Suffering ages faster than time. She held the boy by the hand. Behind them, an older man, probably the grandfather, and a teenage girl, maybe 15. "Forrest," Karl repeated, pointing east. "Run. Don't stop." The woman stared at him. There was something in that face. Something Karl couldn't name. She said something in Ukrainian, One word, a single word he didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Gratitude. They ran. Carl poured the rest of the kerosene on the external wall and set it on fire. The house began to burn, but empty. He did the same with the other 3 houses on that street. Knocked on the door, yelled for them to flee, waited for them to leave, then set it ablaze. The flames rose, and from afar it looked like he was following orders. But they were just empty structures being devoured by fire. When Miller arrived, Carl was covered in soot, sweating, panting. "Finished, sir," he said. Miller looked around. 4 houses in flames, black smoke rising to the gray sky. He nodded, satisfied. "Good work, Schneider. Continue." But Carl didn't continue. In the following hours, he repeated the same pattern, warned, freed, incinerated the emptiness. He saved 27 people that day. 27 souls who should have died, but lived because a German soldier decided to betray everything he was trained to believe in. By nightfall, the village was just ashes and skeletons of charred wood. Officially, Kolodiazny had been cleaned. Officially, there were no survivors, but in the forest to the east, 27 people breathed, shivering with cold and fear, but alive. Carl never told anyone. He couldn't. Desertion, insubordination, treason to the Reich. Any of these accusations meant immediate execution. So he kept that secret like someone burying a corpse at the bottom of the soul, and moved forward. Because war doesn't stop to reflect on moments of humanity. 23 years later, West Berlin, 1964. Carl Schneider was no longer a soldier. He was a history teacher at a secondary school. Married, 2 children. A quiet life, meticulously normal. He never spoke about the war. Never. When asked, he changed the subject or pretended not to hear. His wife, Greta, knew something haunted him but learned not to press. Some men return from war and tell everything. Others bury so deep that not even they can access it anymore. Carl belonged to the second group, until one cold November morning, he received a letter. The envelope was beige, worn at the edges, with Soviet stamps. Sender, Central Agency of Military Records of Moscow. Carl frowned. Why on earth would the Soviet Union be writing to him? He opened it with trembling hands. The letter was formal, bureaucratic. It informed that, as part of a post-war reconciliation program, certain archives were being opened. Documents about population displacements, forced migrations, destroyed villages. And among these archives, one record caught attention. Kolodiazny, 1941. 27 survivors had been registered months after the attack. 27 people who, inexplicably, escaped. Soviet authorities never understood how. The Germans said they had burned everything, but there they were, alive. Hidden in the forest for weeks until partisans found them and took them to a refugee camp. And now, 2 decades later, some of these survivors were trying to locate families separated by war. One woman in particular had asked for help. She remembered the German soldier, described him, blonde, blue eyes, small scar on the left eyebrow. He had yelled for them to flee. He had saved them. Carl's heart stopped. The letter continued. The woman's name was Irina Kowalski. She had attached an old photo. Carl took it from the envelope. The image was faded, yellowed, but clear enough. It was her, the woman from the first house, the one holding the boy by the hand, the one who said that word in Ukrainian. And then came the part that destroyed everything. The letter explained that Irina had been taken to Ukraine as a child in 1926, during one of the forced population displacements. Her original family was from Germany. Her birth surname was Schneider. Carl read again, and again, and again. Schneider. He grabbed another attached sheet, a partial family tree. And there it was. Irina Schneider, born in 1911 in Düsseldorf. Married to Mikhail Kowalski in 1929. Mother of 3 children. Sister of Heinrich Schneider, who had a son named Carl. Carl dropped the papers. His vision darkened at the edges. He staggered to the chair and sat down. breathing like someone who had just run a marathon. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But it was. His mother had told stories about the older sister who disappeared when he was still a baby, taken to Russia, lost, presumed dead. His father tried to find her for years, but the records had been destroyed, borders closed, and eventually he gave up. And now Carl discovered she was alive, that she had been in that house, that he had saved her without knowing. The 8-year-old boy who stared at him through the window was his cousin. That word in Ukrainian, she said, might have been thank you, or maybe brother, or maybe just a whisper of recognition that not even she understood. He hadn't saved strangers. He had saved his own family. Carl spent days in shock, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Greta found him crying in the bathroom at 3 a.m, holding Irina's photo against his chest. He finally told everything. The war, kolodiazny, the order, the disobedience, and now this. You didn't know, Greta said, hugging him. Carl, you couldn't have known. But what if I had known? He replied, voice broken. What if I had obeyed? What if I had burned that house with her inside? The weight of that question was unbearable. Carl replied to the letter, wrote to Irina, explained who he was, what happened, what he discovered. 3 months later, they met. It was in Vienna, neutral territory, a small cafe near the train station. Carl arrived early, sat with his back to the door because he couldn't face the entrance. Each second seemed like an eternity. And then he heard a voice. Carl. He turned. Irina was there. Older, gray hair, but the same eyes. The same eyes that stared at him 23 years ago as she fled to the forest. She held a small purse and trembled. Carl stood up. They stood still, a few meters apart, just looking at each other. And then, simultaneously, they began to cry. There were no words. Didn't need any. They embraced like two people who had been lost in the dark for decades and finally found light. I knew, Irina said in hesitant German. That day when you yelled for us to run, I looked at you and something inside me said, this man has my blood. I didn't understand, but I felt it. Carl couldn't speak, just held her hands, like someone holding something sacred that could disappear at any moment. They spent hours talking. She told about the years in the forest, about how they survived eating roots and hunting rats, about the partisans who found them and took them to the refugee camp, about how she never forgot the German soldier who saved them. Carl told about the war, about the things he saw, about the orders he fulfilled and those he disobeyed, about the weight he carried every day. You saved me, Irina said. Saved my son, my father, my daughter. You gave us life. I didn't know, Carl murmured. I just couldn't. But you could, she insisted. When so many others couldn't, you could. And that means everything. But this story doesn't end in hugs and tears of joy, because the truth is more complex, more painful. Carl discovered that, yes, he saved Irina and her family, but he also discovered that he fulfilled other orders, in other villages, on other days, orders he didn't disobey, houses he burned with people inside, lives he erased. How to reconcile this? How are you hero and monster at the same time? For years after the reunion, Carl plunged into deep depression. He saw therapists, took medication, but nothing erased the central question. Why did he save those people and not others? What was special about kolodiazny, luck, destiny? A moment of weakness that by chance transformed into redemption. He never found an answer. Rena tried to console him. You can't save everyone, she said, but you saved me. And that has to mean something. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe life is just a series of impossible choices, and we spend the rest of our days trying to understand why we did what we did. Carl Schneider died in 1987, lung cancer. He was 70 years old. At the funeral were his 2 children, his wife, grandchildren, and also Irina, and the boy he saved, now a 54-year-old man, civil engineer in Kiev, and the teenage girl who fled, now a grandmother, retired teacher. They took turns speaking, told stories, cried, laughed. And at the end, Irina's son, that 8-year-old boy who stared at Carl through the window, went up to the podium. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "My mother shouldn't be here, my children shouldn't exist." All of this was erased in 1941, but one man hesitated, one man disobeyed, and because of that, we're here. 32 descendants, 32 lives that only exist because he couldn't press that lighter. He paused, wiping away tears. He carried guilt. I know. My mother told me. He thought he didn't deserve to be called a hero because he also did terrible things. And maybe he's right. Maybe none of us deserve the titles we're given. But I want it on record, here and now, that my entire life was a gift from him. And I will honor that gift every day I have left. Today, in the small town of Kolodiazne, rebuilt after the war, there is a memorial. It's not big. It's not famous. It's just a bronze plaque fixed on a stone wall. On it is written, in memory of the 27 souls who survived when they shouldn't have, and of the man who, for a moment, chose humanity instead of obedience. It doesn't have Carl's name, he never wanted it, but the descendants know, and they tell. To the children, to the grandchildren, to whoever wants to listen. And the story raises questions that have no easy answer. How many Carl Schneiders existed? How many soldiers, in how many wars, hesitated at the last second and saved lives without ever telling? How many stories like this were buried because the weight of guilt was too great to be confessed? And more, what makes a man capable of saving some and killing others? Is it weakness, strength, luck, destiny? Maybe we'll never know. Maybe the answer is that we're all contradictory, capable of the best and the worst, depending on the day, the order, the moment. But if there's something we can learn from Carl Schneider's story, it's this. A single gesture matters. He didn't topple the Third Reich, didn't end the war, didn't save millions. But he saved 27, and those 27 generated descendants. And those descendants are scattered around the world today. Engineers, teachers, doctors, artists, people who laugh, cry, love, suffer. People who wouldn't exist if, on that October day in 1941, a German soldier hadn't looked at a condemned house and thought, not today, not here, not them. And maybe that's the greatest lesson of all. That even when the entire world conspires toward evil, one person can say no, can disobey, can hesitate, can choose. And that choice, however small it may seem, can reverberate for generations. Carl Schneider never completely forgave himself, but Irina forgave. Her children forgave. Her grandchildren forgave. And somewhere between guilt and redemption, there's a simple truth: he tried. At an impossible moment, he tried to be human. And it worked. Not for everyone, but for some. And maybe in the end, that's what counts. Not perfection, not complete absolution, but the attempt. The gesture, the instant when you look at the abyss and decide not to jump. This is the story of Carl Schneider, the soldier who saved his family without knowing, the man who carried guilt until his last day, and the imperfect hero who reminds us that even in the middle of hell there's always a choice.